I want you to imagine that the year is 2008, okay? The first iPhone was just released. The best-selling antivirus on the market is Norton Antivirus, Norton AV. Bitcoin was just invented by Satoshi Nakamoto. And for you Swiftie fans, Taylor Swift just released her second album. So if you're me, when I hear about those things, a lot of those things seem like ancient history. They seem like a long time ago. But as we lived through those moments, I'm sure it felt like, or at least it did to me, that change was very slow at times, and it's sometimes almost imperceptible, right? My name is Brady Bloxham. I've been in the cybersecurity industry about 20 years. 20 years ago, I was going through the information systems program at BYU. This was before they had cybersecurity programs, so I had to go through the closest thing I could find, which was information systems. And from there, got an MBA from Idaho State University, worked for the NSA, performing offensive cyber operations for the DoD for a few years. And ultimately from there, started my first two companies, which was Phish Threat, which provided cybersecurity, security awareness training and testing, and Silent Break Security. So Phish Threat was acquired by Sophos in 2016, and Silent Break Security was acquired shortly thereafter by NetSpy in 2020. So I've been fortunate and blessed to be in this industry, like I said, for about 20 years. Most recently, I started a new company named InvokeSec, where I really focus on my two passions in life. One, which is offensive cybersecurity, and the other is cybersecurity education and training. So when we look at the evolution of the industry, there are really three questions that I thought were important to answer over the last 15 years. And first of all, it's kind of tricky to get data over what has really transpired in the industry over the last 15 years from an objective perspective. You know, I'm sure each of us have our own experience, right? But me being primarily offensive, I wanted something more objective. And so what I did was I went and downloaded the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report for the last 15 years. And the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report was really kind of the first of its kind when it came out in 2008. The 2008 report included data dating back to 2004. But one thing I found after looking through 15 years of Verizon Data Breach Investigation reports is they don't even track the data from year to year accurately. So I couldn't even really rely on their data very well. But like I said, the three questions that I wanted to answer and that I saw common throughout all the reports are: where are the threats, who are they targeting, and how are they attacking? Okay, and like I said, my background is primarily offensive. Okay, so I hold the belief that a good defense, or the best defense, is a good offense. And being a basketball fan, when I think of a good offense, I think of a Kobe Bryant offense, right? And a good offense will lead to a defense, or it will lead to emerging real-world attacker methodologies, right? You want to base your offensive techniques off of real-world attacks, and ultimately that will lead to defensive strategies that work. Okay, so let's jump into the first one. The first one is who are the adversaries? Who are the attackers, right? Now, I was able to get this out of the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report dating back to 2008 all the way up to 2023. You can see, obviously, one line stands out, right? External attackers are heavily responsible for over 80% of all of the breaches. Okay, now I wouldn't think that this is necessarily surprising to anyone. one thing that I'm going to try to do throughout this is really just focus on the facts with the hype that we find in the industry, right? And the fact is that external attackers are responsible for over 80% of the breaches. However, when you think about hype or things that get attention, or even the way that we test within organizations, a lot of times it's more representative of an insider threat. For example, a lot of times when organizations get internal penetration tests, what do? They get a small little device, they plug it into their network, and that network provides the pen tester with remote access to their environment, and through that device, the tester conducts their penetration test. Well, my problem with that is that, again, that's not representative of a real-world attack. That's representative of an insider threat. So if you want to better defend against real-world threats, then your testing methodology should reflect against your largest threat, which obviously in this case is more of an external attacker. So threat modeling in a way that makes sense is really the point behind that. So the question is, does your threat model reflect current realistic attack scenarios? And I think a lot of times organizations, because they don't understand realistic or real-world attack scenarios, they're not able to ask the right questions. Okay, the second one is industries. Now, hopefully that's not too small for you to see in the back, but when you look at industries, obviously in the mid 2010s, that's really what I call the Wild West of hacking. That's really where those were the golden days. And so you really see some spikes there, right? And the big spike that you see there is financial institutions, financial organizations. It's no surprise to anyone to know that attackers are going to target financial organizations. However, as the industry matures, you can really see things level off for the most part. Short of, with the exception of public sector there, which is at the top, which is government entities, municipalities, things like that. The next two, finance and healthcare, are both heavily regulated. So what does this teach us? Well, I think this teaches us that compliance is only going to get you so far. In a lot of ways, defending against an attack is like outrunning the bear, right? You don't have to be the best, you just have to be better than the next worst guy. And because so many organizations focus on just compliance and meeting that minimum bar of security, they think that they're good, and as a result, these organizations in finance and healthcare can still get popped. But like I said, for the most part, they've really leveled off. You don't see any of the big spikes. You see kind of all industries being targeted. So again, attackers are opportunistic. They will attack whatever organization they feel they can get into. And of course, there's always the fringe use cases, right, where an attacker is going after a specific organization. But by and large, they are opportunistic and will go wherever they can get in. Okay, the last one is attacker activities, meaning what do they do or how do they get into environments? One thing that really sticks out to me when I saw this was how those two attacks, the top one is use of stolen credentials and the bottom one is ransomware, how they almost mimic each other in their lines. They kind of both went down together and they both came up together. And I was really surprised as I was going through the Verizon data breach investigation reports. I got to 2018 and was looking for the word ransomware in the report. It was not anywhere in the report. Looked into 2019 maybe said something about ransomware, and then all of a sudden you get to 2020 and it's like, hey, ransomware is now becoming a thing. And that was only 3-4 years ago. So again, I guess we'll get into how ransomware has changed, but before moving on, I think one thing that's important to note is exploiting vulnerability accounts for about 7%. So again, comparing real-world attacks to the hype, when you look at the hype that goes into some of the things in our industry, a lot of the hype is in, what's the name of the latest exploit? and patch management and things like that. And I'm not saying those things aren't important, but when you look at the data, most of the breaches just simply are not caused by unpatched software, unpatched vulnerabilities, or the exploitation of vulnerabilities. Most of it is through exploitation of features, of software that's fully patched, or password spraying, use of stolen credentials, things like that. Okay, so what can we learn about these trends? Well, I think one of the main things is something that I've talked about for a while, and that is that attackers follow the same, they follow the same risk management policies or ideas that we do. Okay, the exact same risk model. If any of you are, CISOs or Director of Information Security or over risk management in any way, I'm sure you're familiar with this process, right? You identify risk, you assess the risk, evaluate the risk, you implement a control to mitigate the risk, right? And that's what defensive cybersecurity, for the most part, is really all about, is identifying and mitigating risks. Well, from an attacker's perspective, they do the exact same thing, right? They spend all of their time and money and effort developing this toolkit or developing this piece of malware or developing this piece of ransomware, whatever the case may be, this technique, right? And the last thing they want to do is get it burned. I'm sure we have some red teamers here who have spent a lot of time and effort developing a new capability, and it gets burned on an op, and all of that dev time is now wasted. Well, attackers follow the exact same model. Okay, so they assess the risk, they look at the risk, they assess it, they adapt, and then based on the risk and what they do, they adjust it so the risk ultimately goes down. Okay, so in the words of Tony Robbins, the path of least resistance will never make you proud, but it can make you rich. And that's really what attackers are all about, right? They're not about going above and beyond. They will do the bare minimum to get by, to not get caught. And then when they are forced to adapt, then they will adapt and adjust accordingly. So now that we know that attackers are actually quite good at adapting, if that last chart taught us anything, it's that attackers are good at adapting. They adapt very quick. So what I wanted to do was go over some of the old school attacks that we used, 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago on red teaming and penetration tests and things like that, and how the defense is caught up and how we're being forced to adjust our attacks accordingly. So the first one is malware, okay? I remember writing malware 15 years ago. You didn't have to do any string obfuscation, very little evasion. For the most part, like I said, the primary antivirus was Norton and McAfee. And if you needed to get around them, maybe you used like a polymorphic encoder that was signature-based and allowed you to get around the antivirus, right? But it was certainly not heuristic-based or behavioral-based, anything like that. I think this ultimately really led to the proliferation of cybercrime and APT groups because, like I said, in the mid-2010s, it was like the golden era of hacking. You could throw together some malware. I mean, you can see on the right side, I'm sure the code's too small, you can't really understand it, but in C, that was literally, the 20, 30 lines of code that it took to inject shell code into memory using C++. Okay, and on the left side, that was the macro that we used to write an EXE or a DLL to disk from within a Word document that just wrote a DLL to disk and then executed it. And it worked. It worked 100% of the time. Okay, as a case study of this, if we look at the GitHub code activity for Mimikatz, again, look at the mid-2010s. Look at all of the commit activity that was going on within Mimikatz in the mid-2010s. Okay, and if you look at all of the tools and capabilities that Mimikatz got added to it over that time period, I got golden ticket attack, Kerberoasting, past the hash, LSAS dumping, obviously, past the ticket. All kinds of attacks were added to Mimikatz over this time period. As a result, organizations finally caught up. And in fact, I think I could make the argument that out of all of the open source tools out there, offensive or defensive, no tool has driven more change in cybersecurity than Mimikatz. Again, when you look at everything that they drove Microsoft to do because of everything that this tool could do, finally we roll around to 2020, and if you look at the commit activity within the Mimikatz GitHub repo, it's fallen off a cliff. There's not a whole lot going on at this point. So, and that's largely just because that activity is finally signatured, right? The memory manipulation, the LSAS manipulation, things like that. Microsoft has finally caught up to the point where, and EDRs, which we'll talk about next, have finally caught up to the point where they're able to detect a lot of these, but it took, probably a solid 8 years, 7-8 years to get caught up to the point where they needed to be. And in the meantime, a lot of organizations really suffered from it. So what do attackers using now? Well, we've been forced to transition from, those 30, 40 lines of code that I showed you for code injection have now probably turned into at least a few hundred lines. Attackers are leveraging direct syscalls, which is calling kernel APIs, or indirect syscalls, lolbins, which is living off the land binaries, or leveraging legitimate Windows executables to gain code execution. That way we can kind of hide in the noise. Process hollowing has become more popular as well. Improved encryption. Ransomware has really had to step up their encryption game. And function hashing as well. And again, this is an area where I feel EDR has really made some bounds and leaps to their credit, and in a lot of ways have made it much more difficult for the offensive folks to get around some of these capabilities. It just, they're about 10 years too late. I mean, I remember I used to give talks where we would say in training, all an EDR has to do is catch virtual ALEC, write process memory, and create remote thread. And they would catch, probably 90% of the malware out there. And finally, they're able to do that. So now it's just a matter of, again, because they've stepped up their game, attackers are having to adapt and adjust. And we'll talk next, actually, about how they do that, right? And if you notice, I'm trying to go through the attack chain. We started out with malware. First, an attacker writes malware. The next stage of an attack is getting initial access to the target. In order to get initial access, you typically need C2 infrastructure, and then the last one is objectives. And so we're just kind of working our way through an attack and identifying ways that defenders and, as a response, offenders or offensive people have upped their game as well. So if we look at malicious file attachments, again, back in the golden era, you emailed a macro in as an attachment. There was no linking. It was just direct link. As a result, Microsoft finally added mark of the web, which any file that you download gets mark of the web and is blocked. There are some limitations with that, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Another one is password spraying. Password spraying can still be effective if you don't have 2FA, but a lot of organizations are finally increasing their password policy from the default 8 characters, which is great. We recommend 16 to 20 characters and then only changing it maybe once a year. So you don't need to change it very often, just bump it up to 20 plus characters, and obviously having MFA on all external endpoints. Now, a common theme that we're seeing with how attackers are still getting into organizations is with shared mailbox accounts or service accounts that are enabled and in use on external endpoints, but don't have MFA associated with them because they're shared or are service accounts and aren't associated with the specific user. And so in those cases, you need to be vigilant in disabling or monitoring those accounts for MF or for those external services, because those are the types of accounts that attackers will often exploit. The last one is social engineering, and obviously, if anyone has a cure for social engineering, then you'd be very, very wealthy, right? So social engineering is always going to be around. It's always going to be here. And in the meantime, we focus on technical controls to supplement that. So how have attackers adjusted? Well, again, these are newish, right? These are still in use and can still be quite effective. The first one is HTML smuggling. That's embedding the payload within an HTML file. So now, hey, we're not emailing this doc-enabled, this macro-enabled Word document. We're emailing in this HTML file or getting them to visit this HTML file that automatically downloads the malicious payload within it. Alternatively, you can smuggle it in within like an ISO file. So ISO files don't respect mark of the web. Mark of the web is a feature of NTFS. So, again, we're being forced to adapt in order to get around some of these improved controls. If you're not familiar with lol bins, I would really invite you to look at the URL I provided there. You would be blown away by the number of executables within Windows, legitimate executables within Windows that can start another application. If any of you have just turned on your computer, even if it's a bare install of Windows 11 or Windows 10, you fire up Task Manager, msedge.exe will be there, msedge viewer will probably be there as well, and they're just chilling in the background. Okay, you don't necessarily have to have the browser open, they're just there. And like I said, the scary part is attackers can leverage those to execute another application. Code signing certs or signing code with compromised certificates is also becoming much more common, as well as DLL sideloading and hijacking. So again, none of these attacks are cutting edge. They're not necessarily new, but when done properly, they can still be very effective. Another challenge with initial access is really the definition of initial access is changing, right? Before, we all described networks as this hard outer layer, right? We all liked the M&M example. You have the hard outer shell and the soft GUI on the inside, right? Well, with remote work and cloud attacks and everything like that, really the term initial access is changing to mean much more. We now have all kinds of external endpoints. I bet if I asked who used Teams or Slack, I would probably get 99% of all of your hands up. Those provide additional endpoints that attackers can password spray. They can access, they can do username enumeration through those endpoints without any authentication at all. And after enumerating those endpoints, to identify legit usernames, they can then password spray and, again, do whatever they can to identify those compromised credentials, right? So this is really the area where I feel the defense is not keeping up with the sophistication of the attacks, largely just because initial access has changed. It no longer means getting initial access to an endpoint within the corporate environment. Initial access can be getting VPN access. Initial access could be getting an API key or a token that has been leaked within a GitHub repo or an open S3 bucket. If any of you are familiar with Grey Hat Warfare catalogs all open S3 buckets, and there's a lot of stuff out there. Also, initial access has branched out into initial access brokers or access brokers, these are groups that specialize specifically in gaining initial access and then selling it on the market. This is a trend that I've thought for a while was going to increase as things have become more difficult, primarily because, if you look at the medical field, right? You become a doctor after, whatever it is, 8 years. And then if you want to specialize, what do you have to do? You have to go specialize, be an intern or whatever for another 2 to 4 years, right? And I see cybersecurity going the same direction. The attacks are becoming more and more sophisticated, and as a result, attackers are going to have to specialize. You can no longer be a generalist where, hey, I'm able to conduct this attack chain start to finish. And so I think we're going to see more and more of these access brokers pop up that specialize in initial access and then sell and advertise that access to ransomware groups, APT groups, crimeware groups, all of those kinds of organizations. And how are they doing it? Well, they're doing it using RMM, or remote management and monitoring software, which again, I would guess most corporations leverage some RMM. There's a lot of open source RMMs. If you use like LogMeIn, that's an example of an RMM. Go to my PC, that's another example. Are those software, is that malware? No, of course not. Like, your EDR isn't going to pick that up as malware, but does it provide persistent access to your environment, potentially, over ports 443 that aren't going to get caught? Yeah. And so again, attackers are adapting. They're not stupid. They adapt very quickly. So that's really how attackers are adapting to maintain initial access. The next stage in an attack is it's around C2 infrastructure. And again, back in the golden days of attacking, our C2 infrastructure was very simple. Does anyone remember Cloud at Cost? We had Cloud at Cost for a while. It was the worst VPS ever, and the worst VPS provider ever, and that was our C2. And we would register our own domains, and we were able to get callbacks through it. And we leveraged direct download links as well. There was no obfuscation. There was no filtering. It was very, very basic encryption. Of RC4, there was no secure key exchange or anything like that. So obviously this led to, the defense catching up, right? So defenders looked into domain categorization and reputation, DNS filtering, SSL inspection and traffic analysis, limited egress so that it's only allowed over 80 and 443. Basically, any port that you can proxy, you can allow out, but if you can't proxy it, then you block it because you don't have visibility into it, right? So as a result, attackers were forced to diversify, and as a result, we started leveraging more decentralized services, more legitimate services as well. Now when we get callbacks, we do filtering. We look at the geographic location of the IP address. We look at the user agent string of the IP, or of the connection of the source. Hosting type, is it a Tor IP? Is it coming from a data center? Is it coming from a VPS? We also look into keying of our payloads so that we're not just sending out our payload just because we're getting a callback. So we do all of those filterings prior to sending the payload to the target so that we avoid sandboxes. Another very common one more for bots is domain generation algorithms. And like I said, legitimate cloud services are extremely common. We heavily utilize AWS, Azure, domain fronting, and those types of services so that we can hide our traffic within the noise that these CDN-like services are already providing to their corporations. So there's a very simplified version of a network diagram that kind of illustrates what our infrastructure might look like today. Basically, there's a front plane that manages the callback. There's a back plane that provides further filtering and directs callbacks accordingly based on the tool. So in terms of complexity, it's gone up significantly from where we started. And again, all of this takes additional time and research, right? Okay, so on to the last one, the objectives. So I cheated a little bit on this one. Instead of taking a deep dive into the objectives that an attacker has, I instead wanted to focus a bit on artificial intelligence and how attackers are leveraging artificial intelligence to perform their objectives more efficiently. I personally feel like there's a short-term defensive advantage to AI, primarily just because of information sharing. You know, when we do assessments or when attackers do ops, they don't have the luxury of sharing customer data or target data across a large swath of companies, right? And so when you look at the training data that they have at their disposal, it's much, much smaller. So we don't really have that luxury. However, over time, I feel like that short-term advantage that the defense now enjoys will ultimately, it'll get caught up. There's also a lot of commercial offerings. There's government grants, public investment. Right now, the use cases on the offensive side are pretty small. You know, I'm sure that we've all used ChatGPT for things like, you know, write me a loader or tricking it into helping you write a keylogger or DLL injection. And when done properly, it can be good for that. It's great for pretexting, right? I think the number of emails that have those grammar typos, those grammar issues and typos will be a thing of the past. So we're no longer going to be able to tell our parents, hey, just look for bad English, because now it's just a matter of, you know, putting it through ChatGPT and it has perfect grammar in it. So again, the attack speed is increasing. Attackers are very good at adapting. And ultimately, the offensive side is reliant on open source. The offensive side for AI is we're reliant on the open source community. And so I looked into this a bit more, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Hugging Face. If you're not, you should definitely check it out. You can spend a lot of time on the website. Currently, there's over 500,000 models that you can download off of Hugging Face. You can download them, and if you're interested in spinning up any of your own models, look for ones by the bloke. I'll save you some time, okay? Just look for ones by the bloke. He was actually, I think he was provided a grant by Peter Thiel, which is ironic given Peter Thiel's last comment on AI. But he basically makes available in a much friendlier format a lot of the AI models. On GitHub, there's literally hundreds of thousands of AI projects that you can look through. You can look at their source code. You can, you know, obviously alter your voice. You can put together a RAG pipeline, facial detection. You can build a custom chat bot. There's all sorts of things you can do with AI just with open source code. So it's my belief that while, you know, commercial companies like OpenAI currently have the edge, in the long run, open source is absolutely going to win this battle. The law of diminishing returns is going to apply here to the point where, yeah, OpenAI has a good lead right now, but as AI just in general improves across the board, the open source models will be good enough for 99% of all the use cases. So speaking of the use case, you know, let's say that your boss calls you, via Slack. It's his or her voice, it's his or her Slack account or Teams account, and he or she asks you to wire $22 million. Okay, or let's say it's your CFO, right? What do? Well, a lot of you have probably heard that this really isn't a theoretical story. This happened just a few weeks ago. A company in Taiwan was duped into wiring $25 million because several coworkers and the CFO got on a Teams meeting with a legitimate employee, but the other people on the call were impersonating, through this Teams conversation, they were impersonating coworkers. And they had obviously trained a model to make their faces appear as coworkers of this person, one of whom was the CFO. And because there were coworkers on the call and the CFO was on the call, it looked just like, your normal finance meeting. That employee wired $25 million, and the company ended losing $25 million to it. Now, I think that we all knew that this was going to happen at some point in the future, right? Personally, I was surprised at how quickly the future came. I think that's really the takeaway from this is that it came very quick. So after hearing about it, I wanted to play with it a little bit myself. And so I decided to call through Teams a coworker as Elon Musk. Now, obviously, this is a bald version of Elon Musk. I didn't have a wig at my disposal. And you can't hear the audio, but he basically says something to the effect of, "You look like the Hills Have Eyes version of Elon Musk." So, again, this was done in an afternoon. Okay, this was done in a few hours of just messing around with some GitHub projects. I didn't even have to do any custom training, and the model turned out pretty legit. Right? Now, obviously, if you train the model, you can fine-tune it and do things like that. That will really improve the quality of the model. Okay, so what are some takeaways? Well, again, attackers adapt quickly. Attackers got bills to pay, right? And they're not going to sit around and twiddle their thumbs when one of their payloads gets caught or they're up against a brick wall. They figure it out. So the question is, what are we doing to keep up? And I think as defenders, there are a number of things we can do to keep up. One is education, blogs, conferences, attending conferences such as this, current events, things like that. All of those things help. Ultimately, I think really what it boils down to is, as a defender, like I said, the best defense is a good offense. It's being aware of how attackers think, how they operate. What are the latest offensive trends? Which really leads to the next takeaway, which is correct practice makes perfect. I'm sure that we've all heard the saying, practice makes perfect. My favorite is I tweak that just a little bit to say correct practice makes perfect. Because, again, if you follow the traditional model for, say, an internal pen test where you plug a device into your network, it's not representative of how an attacker is also going to target your organization. So we need to be able to answer things like, do you know your MTTR? Do you know your MTTD? What's your SOX detection capability? You spend millions of dollars on these products and on these people and on these things and these toys. Do we really know how effective they are at helping you establish your defense in depth? So with that, happy to answer any questions that you might have. I don't know how much time we have. Okay. All right, thanks guys.